Imagine for a split second that you are the most powerful man in the music world. A modern god whose voice made Wembley Stadium vibrate and whose pinky finger controlled 100,000 people. But right now, your world has shrunk to the size of a sterile office on Harley Street, smelling of rubbing alcohol and fear. The calendar reads April 29th, 1987. Outside, a typical London rain drizzles, blurring the lights of the city you conquered. But inside this room, time has stopped, turning into a viscous, cold substance. Freddie Mercury sits on the edge of a chair, and his legendary confidence, that very stage armor, has vanished, leaving in its place a trembling man awaiting a verdict. The doctor opposite him avoids eye contact. He shuffles papers with that specific, professional silence that in medicine always means only one thing: bad news. You probably think Freddie suspected something was wrong? Undoubtedly. But suspicion is a hope for a mistake, while what lay on the desk now in a white envelope was a fact not subject to appeal, a death sentence signed by biology itself. To understand the horror of this moment, you must remember the context of 1987. The word AIDS back then wasn't just a diagnosis, it was a leper's brand, a social death that occurred long before physical death. Newspapers called it the gay plague. People were afraid to shake hands or drink from the same mug as the infected. Freddie knew that if this envelope became public, his life as a rock star would end that very second. But the most terrifying enemy was not in the biopsy report, nor in public opinion. The enemy was already inside, and it had left its first ominous mark on the king's body. Look at his right shoulder, hidden under an expensive silk shirt. There, on the pale skin, a tiny, almost imperceptible blue spot had appeared, looking like an ordinary bruise one might get from hitting a microphone stand in the heat of a concert. This is our dagger, the very detail that flips everything. Freddie had likely looked at this spot in the mirror for weeks, trying to convince himself it was just a bruise, that it would pass, that he was invulnerable. But the doctor spoke the words that shattered this illusion. Kaposi's sarcoma. This small blue spot wasn't a bruise. It was a flag the disease had planted on the captured territory of his immune system, a countdown timer that began ticking so loudly it drowned out the sound of the rain outside. You think Freddie burst into tears at that moment? You think he started calling his mom or gathering the band to say goodbye? That would be the normal reaction of an ordinary person, but Freddie Mercury was never normal, and what he did in the following minutes defies every instinct of self-preservation. Walking out of the clinic with the sentence in his pocket, he got into his Rolls-Royce, and instead of going home and falling into an abyss of depression, he put on his dark glasses and ordered the driver to go to the studio. Ask yourself honestly, could you work knowing a bomb was ticking inside you? Could you think about notes and harmonies when your brain is screaming that you have a couple of years left to live, and those years will be hell? Freddie chose a strategy that seems like madness, complete, total, aggressive denial. He decided that if he didn't say the word out loud, if he didn't acknowledge the disease as reality, it couldn't get him. He didn't say a word to Brian May. He stayed silent before Roger Taylor. He created a vacuum of secrecy around himself into which not even his closest friends were admitted, because the equation in his head was simple. As long as they see Freddie the legend, I am alive. As soon as they see a sick man, I die. But this secret came at a monstrous price. Imagine what it's like to stand in a vocal booth, singing about eternal love and joy, feeling that cursed blue spot burning under your shirt, knowing it's not the only one, that soon there will be more, and that every morning will now begin not with coffee, but with an inspection of your own body in search of new traces of decay. He started applying makeup thicker than usual. He started wearing long-sleeved clothes even in the heat. He turned his life into one continuous set decoration, hiding a frightened man desperately trying to trick death by pretending he was too busy for it. You think he was afraid of death? No. Freddie feared something far worse. He feared pity. He saw how the press destroyed Rock Hudson, and he swore to himself he would never let the vultures from the tabloids see his weakness. On that day, April 29th, 1987, music changed forever for Freddie Mercury. It ceased to be just art or a way to make money. It turned into a race against time. He realized he had a limited number of breaths left, and he decided that every one of those breaths had to be recorded on tape. It wasn't workaholism. It was panic sublimated into creativity. He began working with a frantic, frightening speed, recording an opera with Montserrat Caballé, planning new Queen albums, as if trying to create enough music to last for the time when he would no longer be there. But every time he was alone in his bedroom at Garden Lodge, removing his makeup and looking in the mirror, that small blue spot on his shoulder stared back at him, reminding him that no matter how loud he sang, the hourglass had already been turned over, and the sand was falling faster than he could compose melodies. That day, he left the doctor's office not as a patient. He walked out as an actor cast in the hardest role of his life, the role of a living man who knows the exact date of his end, but is obliged to continue the show, even if the auditorium is already starting to empty. You think that after the heavy doors of the clinic on Harley Street closed behind him, cutting him off from the sterile world of medical sentences, Freddie Mercury ran to seek solace from his brothers in Queen? Logic suggests that this is exactly what people facing the abyss do. They look for a shoulder to lean on. They look for those who have been through fire and water with them to share this unbearable burden. But logic is a survival tool for ordinary people, and Freddie at that moment was no longer planning to survive. He planned to enter eternity, and to do this, he needed to pull off perhaps the grandest and cruelest deception in the history of show business. He returned to the studio where Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon were waiting. People who knew him better than his own mother, and looking them in the eye, he put on a mask that would fuse to his face for the next 2 years. Tension hung in the air because the band had just released the successful album A Kind of Magic, and the world demanded a tour. Promoters offered checks with so many zeros it made heads spin. Fans in every capital of the world were pitching tents at box offices, but Freddie, standing before his friends, dropped a bomb that blew their plans to shreds. "We're not going on tour," he said, and his voice held that steely note that brooked no argument. "You think he told them the truth? You think he showed them that blue spot on his shoulder, burning his skin under layers of expensive fabric? No. He told them he was too old, that he was tired of running around stage in a leotard, that he wanted to change the format. It was a lie worthy of an Oscar, but to the band, it sounded like the whim of an arrogant prima donna. And this is where the plot twist effect kicks in, flipping the perception of the situation on its head. Brian and Roger were angry. They felt betrayed. They thought Freddie had become lazy and selfish, depriving them of their career peak for his caprices. They resented him for laziness, while he was saving them from a truth that could have destroyed them. He took the blow of their dissatisfaction, allowing them to consider him the bad guy, just so he wouldn't see pity in their eyes, which for him was scarier than death. But if fooling friends was hard, fooling the camera was practically impossible. And here began Freddie Mercury's real war with his own physiology. By 1988, that lonely blue spot on his shoulder was no longer lonely. Kaposi's sarcoma, an aggressive form of cancer accompanying AIDS, began capturing new territories, blooming on his body in sinister purple flowers that could not be washed away. Every morning turned into a special operation. Freddie spent hours in front of the mirror, not for narcissism as the tabloids thought, but for camouflage. He applied layers of foundation so thick it resembled theatrical makeup, trying to hide hollow cheeks and spots on his neck. He started growing a beard, not for a change of image, but to create a visual barrier hiding how gaunt his face had become. The press, those vultures with telephoto lenses, smelled blood. The Sun began publishing articles with headlines like, "Why is Freddie hiding?" speculating on rumors that he had tested positive for HIV. And what did Freddie do? He went on the attack. Publicly, looking into the camera with that trademark audacity, he declared, "I don't have AIDS. I'm just tired. And anyway, go to hell." Ask yourself honestly, could you lie with such conviction when every headline hits the bullseye of your greatest fear? Most would have broken under this pressure, confessed, asked for privacy. But Freddie understood that confessing now would turn his remaining time into a reality show about death, and he wanted it to be a show about music. It was during this period, when his body began to betray him, when his strength was melting away by the hour, that he made a decision that seems like absolute madness for a dying rock musician. He decided to record an opera album with Montserrat Caballé. Why? Why opera, which requires titanic vocal power when you struggle to climb stairs? The viewer thinks it's his swan song. He wants to prove his greatness. Partly yes, but the truth is deeper and scarier. Freddie knew that rock and roll requires physical activity, jumping, energy he no longer possessed. But opera allows you to stand static. Opera allows you to hide a fragile body in a tuxedo. Opera allows the voice to fly while the body dies. The Barcelona project became his sanctuary, but also his Golgotha. During the performance at the La Nit Festival in 1988, his last appearance on a big stage before a live audience, something happened that remained off-screen for millions of viewers. Freddie was late for rehearsal, not due to a star's whim, as the papers wrote, but because doctors spent hours trying to stabilize his condition, pumping him with a cocktail of drugs just so he could stand vertically. When he walked onto the stage, holding Montserrat's hand, he smiled, but his hand gripped her palm with such force that the diva was left with bruises, not from passion, but because he was using her as a physical support, terrified his legs would give way on live television. He lip-synced, an incredibly rare occurrence for the perfectionist Mercury, because the risks that his voice would crack or his lungs, ravaged by pneumonia, would fail on a high note was 100%. The world applauded the genius. The world saw triumph, but no one noticed how, in the dressing room after the performance, Freddie collapsed onto the sofa, gasping for air, and how beads of cold, sticky sweat broke through the layer of makeup on his temple, the sweat of a man who had just looked into the abyss and managed to blink first. He won this round against death. He fooled everyone, the band, the press, the fans. But when he looked in the mirror, washing off the makeup, he saw that the blue spot which started as a harmless dot had now turned into a map of his inevitable end, and he realized the time for hide-and-seek was running out faster than he could write music. Let's transport to 1991, to a place that should have been a sanctuary, but turned into purgatory, Mountain Studios in Montreux, on the shores of Lake Geneva. If you think the recording of Queen's last album, Innuendo, happened in an atmosphere of creative ecstasy and champagne, you are deeply mistaken. The air in that studio was saturated not with inspiration, but with the smell of antiseptics and a quiet, sticky horror that paralyzed everyone present. Freddie Mercury, the man who once flew over the stage on Superman's shoulders, now came to recording sessions not as a rock star, but as a ghost. His body, once a perfect instrument, had betrayed him completely. That tiny blue spot we noticed in 1987 was no longer a lonely warning. Kaposi's sarcoma had conquered his flesh, turning his skin into a map of pain. One of his feet was so eaten away by ulcers that he couldn't wear shoes and moved in soft slippers, every step requiring effort worthy of climbing Everest. You probably ask yourself, why? Why would a man who has millions, fame, and the love of the world torture himself in a studio when he could spend his last days on his favorite sofa, surrounded by cats and morphine? It's a logical question, but logic is powerless here, because Freddie was driven by something else, a panic-stricken fear that the music inside him would run out before his heart stopped. He worked in kamikaze mode. "Write me anything," he told Brian and Roger, his voice trembling, but his eyes burning with feverish fire. "I will sing it. I will sing anything you give me while I can still stand." But one day Brian May brought a song that was to be an epitaph, a song impossible to sing without tearing one's soul apart. The show must go on. It was the moment of truth. Brian wrote a vocal part that required not just technique, but superhuman power. High notes that pierced the stratosphere. When he showed the demo to Freddie, that visual silence that makes ears ring hung in the studio. Brian looked at his friend, at this emaciated, pale man, struggling to hold a cup of tea, and felt like an executioner. He realized he was asking the impossible. "Fred," Brian whispered, his voice cracking, "I don't know. I think it's too high. Your lungs. We can use falsetto. I can sing some parts for you." Ask yourself honestly, what would you feel in Freddie's place? Relief? Gratitude that a friend wants to shoulder your burden? That would be the natural reaction of a dying man who wants peace. But here occurs that plot twist effect that breaks all templates. The offer of help, dictated by love, Freddie perceived as a challenge, as a slap to his artistic pride. In his eyes, clouded by painkillers, a spark suddenly flared. Not kind, not soft, but furious, almost demonic. It was the look of that same kid who once promised to become a legend, and he wasn't going to let sickness or the pity of friends dictate the terms of his final performance. What did he do next? He didn't start warming up. He didn't ask for water. Slowly, overcoming monstrous pain in his legs, he walked to the table where a bottle of ice-cold Stolichnaya vodka stood. Doctors had forbidden alcohol. His liver was destroyed, his body couldn't process toxins, and any sip could be a fatal trigger. But Freddie poured himself a full glass. Not a tasting portion, but a glass capable of felling an elephant. Brian and producer David Richards froze, afraid to even breathe, watching this act of suicidal defiance. Freddie raised the glass. His hand, which had been shaking before, suddenly became steady as granite, and he downed the vodka in one gulp as if it were the water of life. He slammed the glass down on the mixing console, turned to Brian, and his face, a mask of suffering a second ago, transformed. It wasn't a grimace of pain. It was the snarl of a predator backed into a corner, but ready to launch a final attack. "I'll fucking do it, darling," he growled, and there was not a drop of infirmity in that voice. He stepped to the mic stand, pushing away the offered chair. He refused to sit. He was going to sing standing up, leaning on the stand with the full weight of his crumbling body, turning it into a crutch, holding him vertical in this world. The sound engineer hit the record button. The red on-air light lit up like a cyclops eye, and a moment of absolute vacuum descended on the studio. All that could be heard was the hum of amplifier tubes and Freddie drawing air in heavily with a wheeze. Everyone expected a catastrophe. Everyone expected him to fall, for his voice to crack, for blood to come from his throat. But when the music kicked in and Freddie opened his mouth, a sound of such power and purity burst from this fragile, dying vessel that it physically pressed those present into their chairs. It wasn't the voice of a man. It was the roar of a wounded beast refusing to die quietly. He hit notes that were inaccessible to him, even in his best years of health. He didn't sing the song. He fought it. He violated every phrase, putting into the words, "Inside my heart is breaking." Not acting, but the real sound of his heart tearing into pieces right now, live on air. Brian May, standing at the console, wept without shame, because he was witnessing a miracle that defied medical explanation. That blue spot, that disease which devoured his muscles and skin, proved powerless before his gift. AIDS could kill his body, but in those 4 minutes of recording, it couldn't touch his spirit. Freddie sang as if he wanted this vocal to remain in eternity as proof of his victory, as a monument to his will. He finished the first take, and when the music faded, he didn't fall. He stood holding the stand, soaked in sweat, pale as death, but with a victor's smile on his face. He knew he had just done the impossible. He knew he had cheated death for one more day. But he didn't know that this triumph was the last supernova flash before total darkness fell, and that the price for this vocal feat would be billed to him immediately, as soon as the adrenaline and vodka left his blood. When the Stolichnaya vodka burned his throat, washing away the taste of blood and antiseptics, and the empty glass landed with a dull thud on the mixing console, something happened in Mountain Studios in Montreux that defies all laws of medicine and acoustics. You think the magic of music is inspiration? You are wrong. That day, magic was an act of pure distilled violence against dying flesh. Brian May, standing behind the glass in the control room, turned pale, his hand hovering over the volume fader, because he was certain, right now, before his eyes, a catastrophe would occur. He waited for Freddie to collapse, for his lungs, eaten by pneumonia, to simply burst from the tension required for a vocal part of such complexity. After all, The Show Must Go On is not just a song. It is a vocal Everest requiring steel diaphragm muscles, which Freddie seemed to no longer possess. But when the red record lamp flared, turning the vocal booth into a confessional, Freddie Mercury closed his eyes, gripped the microphone stand until his knuckles turned white, and opened his mouth. What burst out was not the voice of a sick man. It was a sound that made sound engineer David Richards recoil from the monitors, as if hit by a blast wave. Have you ever heard what despair sounds like when smelted into absolute power? This was that sound. Freddie didn't sing. He erupted notes, each purer and higher than the last. Ask yourself, how is this possible? How could a man who, an hour earlier, couldn't walk to the bathroom on his own, suddenly find the strength of an opera tenor? Doctors would tell you it was agony, a final burst of adrenaline before the end. But the truth was far more frightening and majestic. Freddie Mercury in that moment ceased to be a man of flesh and blood. He turned into pure spirit, using his crumbling body as fuel, burning himself alive to produce that sound. But here is where the dagger we spoke of at the beginning kicks in. That tiny blue spot on his shoulder that had now grown into a map of his suffering. As he sang the lines, "Inside my heart is breaking, my makeup may be flaking," it wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal physiological broadcast of what was happening to him in that second. The sarcoma was devouring his skin. The makeup was indeed flaking off his face, unable to withstand the streams of cold sweat. And his heart was working at its limit, trying to pump blood through an organism poisoned by toxins. You think he didn't feel pain? Oh, he felt every second. Every breath was a battle. Every high note was a knife blow to the chest. But it was this pain that gave his voice that metallic, piercing resonance that cannot be acted. He wasn't playing the role of a tragic hero. He was one, and the microphone was recording not just air vibrations, but the sound of his disintegration. And then comes the moment that makes you question reality. Brian May waited with dread for the climax of the song, that transcendently high note in the finale, where he feared Freddie's voice would break and the magic would vanish, exposing the ugly truth of the disease. But when Freddie reached that summit, he didn't just hit the note, he attacked it. He struck it with such fury, with such flawless precision, that dead silence hung in the control room. It was an intellectual epiphany for everyone present. They realized that the disease could take everything from him: beauty, strength, movement, but it lost the battle for his voice. The sarcoma could destroy tissues, but it couldn't touch the divine gift that lived in his throat. It was a paradox. The most ruined body in the world was producing the most perfect sound in rock history. When the music faded and the last chord dissolved into the air, Freddie didn't wait for applause. He didn't smile. The energy keeping him vertical instantly evaporated, as if someone pulled the plug from the socket. He slumped, hanging onto the mic stand, turning back from a god into a dying old man in a youth jacket that hung on him like a sack. Brian May, watching this through the glass, wept openly, because he understood they hadn't just recorded a hit, they had documented a miracle. Freddie looked at them, wiping sweat with a trembling hand, and said in a mundane tone, "I think that was all right, yeah?" All right? It was beyond the bounds of human possibility. He recorded one of the most difficult vocal parts in music history in one take, with one foot in the grave. But the most terrifying discovery awaited them ahead. You think after this, he went home to rest? No. Freddie knew this might be the last time his voice sounded so powerful. He felt the darkness thickening, and he said, "Let's keep recording. Write me lyrics, write me music. I will sing until I drop." He turned the studio into a race against death, trying to leave behind as much material as he could before the blue spot reached his lungs completely. He recorded vocal tracks for songs that didn't even have music yet, leaving the band instructions, "Finish this when I'm gone." It was an act of supreme self-sacrifice. He was stealing time from his death to gift it to us. That day in Montreux, music wasn't just recorded, it was torn from oblivion. And the price for this trophy was paid with the life of a man who refused to be a victim even a second before the end. When the final note of "The Show Must Go On" faded in the studio speakers, and the echo of that inhuman vocal feat dissolved into the air of Montreux, Freddie Mercury didn't just walk out of the booth, he walked out of history, leaving behind a door that no one will ever be able to open again. You probably think that such a triumph of spirit should be followed by a Hollywood ending, where the hero walks into the sunset to applause, but the reality of November 1991 was devoid of cinematic gloss. It was harsh, quiet, and smelled of inevitability. Freddie returned to London, to his Garden Lodge mansion, and those high brick walls that once protected his privacy now turned into the walls of a fortress besieged by death itself. That tiny blue spot on his shoulder, which in 1987 seemed like a harmless bruise, had by this moment won the war for his flesh. It had multiplied, conquered territory, turning his body into a map of pain, but, and this is the paradox that breaks the brain, it never managed to reach his essence. In the last days of his life, Freddie committed an act that many consider a surrender, but which was actually an act of supreme control. He refused all medication except painkillers. Ask yourself why. Why hasten the end when you have access to the best medicine in the world? The answer flips everything on its head. Freddie wasn't surrendering to death. He was scheduling a meeting on his own terms. He could no longer sing, could no longer stand at the mic, and life without music for him was not life, but existence, which he despised more than anything in the world. He decided to turn off the lights himself, not waiting for the disease to make him a helpless doll, and there was more rock and roll in this decision than in any instrument smashed by a guitarist. The last photo of Freddie, taken in the garden of his home shortly before the end, became an icon of this period. He stands in sunglasses, in a baggy suit hiding his emaciated body, and smiles. But look closer at that smile. It is not the smile of a man hoping for a miracle. It is the smile of a man who knows a secret. He knew that in the studio safes lay tapes with his voice, pure, powerful, immortal, a voice that would sound in 10, 20, 50 years, when not even ash would remain of his sick body. He looked into the camera lens and saw not the photographer, but the future he had already conquered. He understood that he had fooled everyone. He made death work for him, turning his agony into art that would outlive him. And here comes the moment of that intellectual epiphany, where all lines converge to a single point. Remember that blue spot from the beginning of our story. Doctors told him in 1987 that his time was up. They gave him a sentence in an envelope. But Freddie took that sentence and used it as fuel. If not for that spot, if not for that sword of Damocles hanging over his head, would he have recorded "The Show Must Go On"? Would he have sung Barcelona with such frantic passion? Would he have created the album Innuendo, which sounds like a testament? The paradox is that the deadly disease didn't kill his creativity. It catalyzed it. It forced him to discard everything superfluous, all the tinsel, all the laziness, and concentrate on the only thing that mattered, the sound. Death wanted to take everything from him, but in the end, it gifted him eternity, forcing him to burn so brightly that we still see the light from that fire today. But when on November 24th, 1991, the world learned that Freddie was gone, shock was replaced by a strange feeling akin to betrayal. Fans sobbed, but many asked the question, why was he silent? Why didn't he tell us sooner? Why did he deprive us of the chance to say goodbye? This silence, which he kept for 4 years, hiding the diagnosis even from close friends, became his final shield. You think he was afraid of our reaction? No, he was protecting us. He was protecting us from the spectacle of a fading star. He wanted us to remember him as a god at Wembley Stadium, in a yellow jacket, with a fist raised to the sky, not as a patient in pajamas. He sacrificed our sympathy for our admiration, and this was the choice not of a victim, but of a director editing his final film so the audience remembers only the best shots. Now, as we stand on the ruins of this tragedy and look at the legacy he left, I want to ask you a question that might seem cruel, but is necessary to understand the scale of Freddie Mercury's personality. We are used to demanding full openness from stars. We want to know about every sore, every tragedy in real time. But did Freddie have the right to this lie? Was his decision to hide the diagnosis until the last day an act of supreme selfishness, depriving the world of the chance to support him in his fight? Or was it an act of supreme mercy and artistic courage? Whose side are you on in this story? On the side of those who believe he should have become the face of the fight against AIDS while alive, using his influence to save others? Or on the side of those who believe his only duty was to sing until his lungs failed, and that he gave us everything he had, leaving for himself only the right to die in silence, without camera flashes and pitying glances? Who was he in this final act? A coward hiding from the truth behind makeup, or a hero who sacrificed his peace so the show would go on even when the actor was already leaving the stage? Write your opinion in the comments. Psych. I will be waiting, because the answer to this question determines what is more important to us: the man or the legend he created at the cost of his own life.